Welcome to the TV library. Today we will be discussing the life and story of Marie Curie's daughter, Irene Curie, and her husband, Frederic. Marie Curie was certainly the best-known female scientist of her time, and thus this must have made her daughter feel overshadowed at times. Irene was alone at home. Her husband, Frederic, had an early lecture in the morning. Their two children were taken for a walk by the nanny, and Irene was sitting at the desk and she had finished her research paper. Out of the blue, the doorbell rang, and while she was still wondering who could be visiting at such an early hour of the morning, the doorbell rang again. It seemed to be urgent, and while she began to feel uncomfortable, she rushed to the door, and when she opened it, there stood a man in uniform who said, "I have a telegram for Frederic and Irene Curie, and it is from the Swedish Academy of Science." Irene held her breath, and at the same time several thoughts flashed through her mind with stories that her mother had told her. She had loved all the stories her mother told her while she was still just a little child. Stories about her scientific research which she had conducted with her father Pierre. Above all, though, she loved to hear about her parents' successes in the laboratory and about discovering the unexpected truth about nature. It was not long before her child days were over, as were times of peace. War broke out when Irene was just 17 years old, and she started working with her mother in the military hospitals, and together they supervised the X-ray machines. There in 1924 she met the handsome and very bright young technical assistant Frederic Joliet. She fell in love with him and they married. Life was easy for her during that period. Sometimes she had the feeling that some of her co-workers saw her only as the daughter of Marie Curie, rather than a radioactive researcher in her own right. Irene and Frederic gained more and more approval in the laboratory as they were successfully applying new techniques. In some of their experiments with a cloud chamber, she and Frederic had observed particles which seemingly had strange properties. They were positively charged. Thus, they should have been protons. But some measurements seemed to indicate that they had about the mass of an electron. This was weird, if not impossible. She recalled another time that she and Frederic had been busy doing other experiments in which materials were exposed to A radiation. Irene had said, "Let us set this result aside. It is probably just an artifact of the apparatus. You know how error-sensitive it is, particularly in the mass determination." Frederic agreed. "Yes, and our experiments with the A particles go well, particularly the exposure of materials containing hydrogen, show really interesting results. It seems that we have produced another mechanism of setting free protons." 9 months later, Frederic entered the laboratory with a journal in his hand and said excitedly, "Irene, the new physics review just arrived. There is an article by a certain Mr. Anderson. He claims to have found traces of a positive electron. He actually calls it a positron." Irene took the article, quickly glanced through it, looking carefully at the pictures from the cloud chamber that were printed in the article, and said, "This is very similar to our findings. Maybe it was not an artifact after all. We probably should redo the experiments as soon as possible." They looked at each other and smiled. On the one hand, a bit disappointed, as they were well aware that it was too late to claim priority, but on the other hand, they were happy because they were aware that the experiments were contributing to the development of scientific knowledge. Irene and Frederick traced the particles that were emitted from materials containing hydrogen when being exposed to A radiation. Initially, they had considered these particles to be protons. But then, a paper by an English researcher, Chadwick, appeared in which those particles were characterized as being something new, namely particles without a charge and about the mass of a proton. Once Chadwick had identified these neutrons, all Irene and Frederick could do was once again to confirm his experimental findings. However, there was something else that puzzled them, something that seemingly had not been noticed by other researchers. If Chadwick's findings are correct, our data seem to confirm his so-called neutron, then how does it work? Irene asked again. Frederick looked up from his instrument and said in a somewhat frustrated voice, "I really don't know, Irene. When a proton is emitted from the aluminium, it is obvious. We get a silicon atom. But what kind of atom can be formed when a neutron is emitted? And what is worse, we also have these positrons that are emitted as well. I have no idea how to explain that." Well, if we have a neutron and a positron, then that would bring us back to silicon. However, it would be very unusual to have the triggered emission of two particles simultaneously. Let us carry out the experiment once again. This reminded Irene of another experiment she conducted with her husband Frederick. They started to set up the apparatus and began to observe the experiment. However, the result remained unchanged, and Frederick finally removed the A particle source. Irene was still looking at the setup and suddenly became excited. "Frederick, look! There is a small trace of positron!" Frederick looked up and said, "No, this can't be. You probably have just misinterpreted something." But Irene was sure. There was still a trace of positron. "Look, there was just another one!" "Impossible," mumbled Frederick, and he came to take a closer look. He waited. "Nothing," he said. I don't see anything unusual," but Irene insisted. "This is something we have to check out again." Frederick brought back the A source. They irradiated the aluminium foil once again for some time, and then removed the source to observe their traces. "There!" shouted Frederick and Irene, and they responded almost simultaneously. "That was a positron for sure!" said Irene and Frederick, nodding, and he replied, "You're absolutely right. How can this be? When we irradiated materials with A particles, the result is a transmutation of a new element. But this is an instantaneous process. So how can it be that we have this radiation even though there was no A source anymore? Only..." He silenced, and they both looked at each other. "Only," said Irene triumphantly. She was beginning to make an astonishing discovery. As she stood there, reminiscing over her life's achievements, the telegram delivery man coughed in order to interrupt her daydream. "Oh, sorry, forgive me, I was in another world there. Do you want me to open the telegram now?" The man looked somewhat puzzled and responded, "No, madam, I just need your signature. Could you sign here, please?" Irene hesitated. Her heart was beating very fast, and she thought to herself, should she open it now or wait for her husband to return? Finally, she decided to open it, and much to her amazement, she realized that both her and her husband, Frederick, had received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. which is awarded to both Irene and Frederick Joliet Curie in recognition of their synthesis of new radioactive elements. And that's all we have time for today. Thank you. Bye for now.